Welcome back to the Foundation in C# course. We are currently in Module 4, and this lesson, we're going to tackle another mini project. In fact, we're going to go back to a project we did in Module 2, which was the guest book. Because now that we have some more tools to work with, I think we can make a better guest book. So let's go ahead and tackle that. So let's open up Visual Studio and go File, New Project. Let's add a console application for .NET Framework. Call it Console UI. Let's call this Better Guest Book. And hit OK. The first thing we do is add our console.readLine. Now, as good developers, we know that we're going to put all the code we can into our class library. So we need a class library. So right-click on Solution. We had a list of string to work with. And so it was not really that easy because we could only ask for one piece of text. Now, they could have said Tim, Corey, and their message, but that might have been formatted ugly. Some people might have said Tim. Some people might have said, full name like with a middle initial or no message. It could have been a mess. So we just asked, I believe, for first name. Now we're going to ask for 3 pieces of data from them separately. And we're going to store each of those pieces of data separately. So let's start off by creating our model to hold our data. And where does that go? It goes in the library. And I'm going to actually create a folder in the library for models. Now, this shouldn't be a very big library because there's not a whole lot we're going to do here, but I still want to organize it this way because one of the things that happens to applications, especially over time, is they grow. And so I don't want to get stuck down the road with something that I thought, it's only 2 classes. And then next thing I know, I have 200 classes and the last 50 are organized, but the others aren't because it was just one more, and then all of a sudden it's a mess to deal with. And it's hard to move things because changing namespaces will break a lot of stuff unless I go back through and make changes everywhere. So instead of doing all that, I just do it right the first time. So models, inside here, add a class. We're going to call this let's call it guest model. Because that's a little more specific than person because a person might not have a message to the host. Make it public, but a guest does. So, string first name, string last name. I'm using that prop, tab, string message to host. Okay, and I am saying message to host because I want to be very specific there as to what type of message that is. It's not a warning message. It's not an informational message. It's not a message to themselves. It's not a message for an answer machine. It's the message to the host. By being more specific here, I allow myself the clarity down the road to understand what that message is, and the clarity to not confuse it with a different type of message I'm thinking about later. Both of those have happened to me in the past where I have not had that clarity. Okay, now I need to add a reference in my console UI to my guestbook library. Right-click on References, Add Reference, come down here to Guestbook Library, make sure Library is on the end, so I'm doing it in the right order, and hit OK. Now I have my reference. I can even add my using statement up here, using guestbooklibrary.models. So I have that for when I'm ready. Now, I'm going to capture the information about each guest. How many guests? We don't know. Could be 0, could be 1, could be 100. So let's assume, and this is one of those things when you're looking through requirements, there are assumptions in place. You should work to identify them. Now, right now, we're doing a small project, and so we're not doing a ton of planning. As your projects get bigger, and by bigger, I mean even a little bigger than this, you should take more time to plan out your project. In fact, in the next module, I'll be introducing you to my planning system. It's a 5-step process that you walk through in order to make sure that you understand what you need out of the application, because assumptions can really bite you down the road. If you assume something and then that assumption turns out to be false, then you've got a problem that you may have to rewrite code because of, or a lot of code. And that's where bugs come in. Rewritten code to change based off different requirements can cause major issues. So just be careful to plan your application out and understand your requirements. So the requirement here is capture the information about each guest. It does not say about how many guests. So the assumption, at least one guest, and unknown maximum. Okay, so we know we're assuming at least one guest is going to come to the party and use this application. If nobody comes, there's no reason to print out the information about nobody. So therefore, this app doesn't have a purpose if it has 0 guests. So therefore, we're assuming at least one guest. And I think that's a fair assumption. And that does make a difference in how we code our application. And you'll see that in just a minute. So for each one, an unknown maximum, meaning there could be 1, there could be 100, there could be 1,000. We're going to capture the first name, last name, and message to the host. So let's start down here by saying we're going to need to hold information about the guests. In fact, we're going to say list of guest model. Guest model. Guests equals new list of guests model. So we're going to say we're going to use a list, because a list you can just keep adding to. An array you can't. You have to specify how many people are coming. But a list you can just keep adding to. So that will hold all of our guests. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to loop through each guest. So we're going to say, you know what, we're going to need to have a string done, or no more guests equals empty string for now. We're going to have a do loop. Do while no more guests to lower does not equal yes. Okay, so yes will mean no more guests. No will mean there's more guests coming. And I'm not a big fan of that. So let's change this naming to more guests coming. Now I changed up here, but if I hit Control Dot now, I can rename it everywhere it's used. In this case down here. More guests coming equals yes. That makes more sense, I think. So we're going to ask them, are more guests coming? And if they say yes, if more guests coming equals yes, go again. That makes more sense, I think. Never be afraid to tweak your code and to make it a little bit more readable. The other thing to note is right now I'm assuming that everything goes in static void main, and I'm just putting code here. But I may come back and look at this and say, you know what? I should pull this out into a different method or even into my class library. And I'm okay with putting it here first because I really need to see it. And that's part of me being a visual learner, but also it's just the idea of it helps me visualize what's going on. And this can be a rough draft. And this is called refactoring. The idea that you get it to work first and then you make it better. Okay, so I can refactor this later as long as I don't say tomorrow. If you say tomorrow, it won't happen. But if you say, I'm going to get it to work and then refactor it right away, that'll probably happen. But planning to do it tomorrow, I won't say never happen, but it does. But in general, I've found it's less likely. So what code goes in here? Well, the first thing I'm assuming with a do loop is we're going to run the code at least once. And that's why I said assumption of at least one guest. Because now we can say console.write, what is your first name? And then we can say, we can create a variable for this, or we can do is we can actually say guest model guest singular equals new guest model. Now, this is something very important to point out. Guests is plural because a list holds 0 or more of this model. So therefore it's plural. Guest is singular because it holds one guest. If you look at the name of my model, it's also singular. Why? Because this represents one person or one guest in this case. So it's the blueprint for one guest. So it's singular. Just pay attention. Those subtle little things make a difference because now I can say, and it makes it very easy to understand, guest. Well, is guest one or is it many? Well, it's singular, so therefore it's one. Guests. Is that one or is it many? Well, it's plural, so it's many. All right. So I'm going to create a guest here and then say guest.firstname equals console.readLine. Now I'm assuming they give us good information. Is that a valid assumption? Probably not. But at the same time, what am I going to do to validate their name? Do I say it has to be one of these, top 1,000 names? No, of course not, because that's silly. Do I say it has to be a certain length? Well, probably, but that length can be pretty lengthy. I mean, maybe 50 characters and no less than one character. So it has to be 0 or 1 or more characters, I guess. So I'm not going to validate this because it really is a guest book. And just like a paper guest book where people write in it, they can write pretty much whatever they want. I'm going to say for this application, that's okay. In a larger context or a larger application where I'm saving this data, I would probably have some kind of validation routine I run against each record. But for this one, I'm going to say no validation necessary. So console.write, what is your last name? and then guest.lastname equals console.readline. And then one more time, console.write. What message would you like to tell your host? Guest.message to host equals console.readline. So there are 3 messages. And now we'll say is console.write, are more guests coming? And then yes/no. And more guests coming equals console.readline. And that's where we're going to fill this in. All right. And the last thing we'll do is right after this, we're going to do a console.clear, just to clear out the previous guest information and not clog up with tons of information. Okay. So we're going to come down here. The very first thing we do is the do, which means run this code at least once. So we create a new guest model. We fill in the first name, the last name, the message to host, and then ask if there's more coming. If there are, we go and do it again. We're missing one thing here, and that is now we have our guest. Remember that this variable here only lives inside these curly braces, so it dies at the end. It gets cleared out. Before it does, we want to say guests.add guest. All right, so you've added that guest to the list. Now go back to the top and do it over again. Once we are done, then we're going to pop out of this list, out of this loop. So a do loop is done when they say no, or basically anything besides yes to our more guests coming. At that point, all we need to do is once done, loop through each guest and print their info. So I'm going to do a for each. I will say guest model, guest in guests. And I'm going to do a console write line here. Now I could put my code right here, but if it makes sense, I think right here to put my code in my guest model for a read-only property that puts this information together. So public string, and let's call this guest info. Get and return $, a couple double quotes and semicolon, and we will say first name space last name colon space message to host. All right, because I might be using this in other places, and that's a pretty standard way of laying it out. And it's a pretty standard thing to ask for, is all this information on one line. So now I can just say guest dot message to, nope, it is guest info. There we go. So print out guest.guest info as that full information, and we're good to go for each guest. And that's all there is to this guest book. Let's run it first, and then let's look at if we need to refactor something. So let's hit start. What's your first name? Tim, Corey. Hello, sir or madam. Yes. First name, Sue, Storm. Good day. No. So Tim Corey says hello, sir, madam, and Sue Storm says good day. All right, so our guest book works. Now we need to look at, can we do something to make this more efficient or to make it more modular or in some way make our code better? And I think the answer is yes, because I think we're violating SRP, the single responsibility principle, the idea that each method does one thing, because our method is doing more than one thing. Our main method is getting guest info, and it's printing out guest info, and it's controlling the processor flow. So let's refactor this. Right down here, guests.add. The problem is that it does not have access to this guests list, because this list lives inside these curly braces, and the stuff inside these curly braces does not have access to that stuff. So there's a couple different things we can do. One, I could pass this list into my method, because this list right here, remember, it's a instantiated list, which means the guests variable just holds the address to the house that was built. So therefore, if I pass the address through to this method, then I could make changes to that house and maybe reflect it up here. The other thing I could do is I can move this list right here. I can cut it out here, and I can paste it in here. And now I have to make it static. So private static. There we go. Now it lives outside of my method. I can only do this with variables, not with code itself. But with variables, they can live outside of a method. Now, this lives inside these curly braces. And there it comes all the way down to here. Which means that down here, I have access to that list. Now, which method you choose, either passing it in as a parameter or using it at the larger scope, is kind of up to you. It just depends on how much you're going to use it, because this now lives for a life cycle or lifespan of program, which is the entire length of the entire application. You might not want this list to live that long. It takes up memory space, so it's kind of up to you. But in this case, it's going to live that long no matter what, because I declare it in main. And remember, main is the one that starts our application and it ends at this curly brace. So therefore, it's going to live that long no matter what. So I feel comfortable putting it up here. And now I have access to it from other methods. So this get guest information method has access to it. And the next method I'll create, which is the print guest information, which is this stuff right here. You cut that out. I'll too far. Go back. It's in there somewhere. Then you come down here, and all you have is the code to get the guest information. That's it. So now you've made something really simple to debug. But I don't think we're done yet with our optimization. Because if you notice, I have this pattern. Print out information, read the console, and put the information into a variable. These two lines, over and over and over. That sounds like I am repeating myself. And we follow dry. Don't repeat yourself. So if you see this repetition, even as small of a repetition, think, I wonder if I can make that better. So, private static string get info from console. String message. And now I can say string output equals empty string. Console.write message output equals console.readline. Return output. Yes, that's a little more verbose, but I could have made it the same two lines if I wanted to. But I'm not going to. Give me a little more verbose because it makes it easier for debugging. So get info from console. All right, I'm going to paste that in everywhere. It's going to throw some errors in a minute, but that's okay. Maybe I can fix that real quick. So now I have this. I can cut this out and paste it in place here. So now it just says guest.firstname equals get info from console. What's your first name? Makes it a little easier, right? Takes away two lines, replaces it with one. And I am done. So now I have these four lines. First name, last name, message to host, and are more coming. I have just one line that says get info from console. This is the info I want. Boom, done. All right, so now this is even shorter of a method. And I think that's all the optimization I want to do. I don't think there's any more reasonable optimizations that would make it significantly better. But I think those optimizations right there help us out. Now, so far, I've put everything in program.cs. Could we move them somewhere else? Yeah, probably. But the question is it going to help my application right now? Probably not. And so the balance is how much do I prepare for the future and how much do I worry about right now? Because if I move these into separate class files, I might be guessing at what the structure is going to look like down the road. And if I'm guessing wrong, then I'm creating just as much a mess as if I leave it alone. If I leave it alone, yes, they have to be dealt with in the future if we add a lot more stuff. But on the other hand, there's not much to change. So it's kind of that balance to hit. And I think at this point, simple is best because I'm not assuming I'm going to come back to this application. And I'm assuming if I do, that I will handle moving things around first once I know the more requirements we need to expand this application to. Okay, so I'm going to leave these right where they're at. Notice the order does not matter of methods. Print guest is first, but it's called second. Doesn't matter. C# just says, oh, I know there's one here somewhere. I'll go find it. All right. So, but this way right here, it's very easy to break apart. It's very easy to read what's going on. And even if we get down here to our get guest information, and it calls submethods itself, it's very easy to read what they're doing. Get info from console. What do you think that does? Probably gets info from console. All right. So it makes it really easy to understand our application, makes it easy for someone else to come in and read our application, which is really the whole point. And I've said it before, I'll say it again. I love vacations. And as a developer, if you love vacations, you should write code that's easy to read. Because if you write mission critical code and then try and take a vacation and no one else can modify your code, no one else understands it, and there's a problem, guess what? Your vacation's over. You have to get back on the computer and fix the code. I don't like doing that. I like not thinking about work when I'm not at work. The way I do that is to write code that's so simple the intern can change the code. And you do that by great naming and breaking things into small chunks, not trying to do everything in static void main. Okay? So that's the more advanced or the better guest book. The idea that we're using a model which stores 3 pieces of information together, and it allows us to concatenate that information in a separate property that we can just call. We don't have to build this string on our own. So that brings us to our pro tip, which is design your app with just the UI content in the UI. Put everything else in the class library. Now let's go back to the code real quick. I have methods that are in the UI, but guess what those methods do? They write to the console, they read from the console, they clear the console, they write line to the console, and they read line. These are all UI specific methods. And so they're in the user interface. But any code that is not user interface specific goes in the class library. Okay? So there's not much in this case, but there's a little bit, and every little bit helps. All right? So that's our tip for today. Make sure you separate those two out and only put UI stuff in the UI. Everything else goes in the class library. All right, your homework. I want you to recreate what we did here without looking at it. Just take the requirements of a guest book, maybe add a few even, and then try and build that application without looking at what I did. And the reason I say don't look at what I did is because it helps you with the idea of not just copying what I do, but actually thinking through the process and getting that muscle memory down of when I need this, I do this. When I need a model, I create a class in a class library and do prop tab and create that property. When I need a read-only full property, this is what I do. And so doing that kind of stuff will, without watching, will help you grow that confidence in yourself and also make sure you are retaining what you are watching. Okay? So make sure you do that without looking. If you have to look, then try it again after you did it once until you get to the point where you're confident in doing it. And make sure you tweak it a little bit. Maybe ask for a person's age and don't forget to convert to an int. All right? Or maybe ask for something else, like a Boolean or something else, and try and convert it and save it with the rest of the data. Once you've done all of that, then move on to the quiz.